The Middle Ages, for centuries, storytellers and films have painted them in golden light. An age of chivalry, gallant knights on horseback, castles rising above green valleys, and maidens in silk gowns gazing from stone towers. We imagine bustling markets filled with spices and silks, churches glowing with stained glass, and nobles feasting in candlelit halls. It feels almost like a fairy tale, but fairy tales are lies. The truth of the Middle Ages is far darker, stranger, and more unsettling. Behind the glitter of knights and kings lay a world dripping with filth, ruled by superstition and haunted by death at every turn. An age where famine could wipe out entire regions, where a single cough might herald the coming of the plague, where torture was not whispered of, but displayed as spectacle. Tonight, you will walk those crooked streets, you will smell the rot, hear the cries of the condemned, and stand beneath the shadow of the gallows. We will tear away the shining armor and look upon the Middle Ages as it truly was, brutal, fearful, and fragile. The street is narrow, hemmed in by timber houses leaning so far toward each other they almost touch above your head. Their upper stories jut out like crooked teeth, shutting out the sunlight. The air is damp, heavy with smoke from countless hearth fires. At first, you hear laughter, children chasing each other barefoot, merchants shouting their prices, a blacksmith hammering iron at his forge. But then other sounds creep in, the squeal of pigs rooting through garbage, the buzz of flies around something left rotting in the gutter, the distant barking of dogs fighting over scraps. Now, breathe in. The illusion shatters. The stench is overwhelming. There are no sewers, no pipes beneath your feet. Waste is everywhere, human and animal alike. Chamber pots are emptied from windows straight into the street. If you are unlucky enough to be walking beneath, you will feel it splash against your cloak. The cobblestones are slick with mud, dung, and rot. And yet this is normal. This is daily life. Streams run through many towns, but they are not clean. People draw drinking water from the same channels where others dump refuse, wash clothing, and even slaughter animals. The water shimmers with a greasy film, a silent poison waiting in every cup. Bathing is rare, even considered dangerous. Many believe that hot water opens the pores and invites sickness into the body. Some bathe only a few times a year. Others never bathe at all. Instead, they mask the odor with perfumes, herbs, and powders. Beneath the fine clothes of a nobleman or the rough tunic of a peasant, lice crawl freely. Fleas infest straw bedding, skin diseases flourish unchecked, and rats always rats, bold black, fat from feeding on scraps. They scurry beneath the feet of passers-by, darting into shadowed corners, thriving in the filth. No one pays them any mind. They're a part of the landscape as normal as the church tower or the marketplace. But these rats are not harmless. They carry passengers' tiny fleas clinging to their fur, hungry for blood. Fleas that will one day leap from rat to man, bringing with them a death that will blacken Europe. The houses themselves are traps of misery. In the poorest quarters, families of 6, 8, even 12 crowd into one dark room. The floor is not wood or stone, but hard-packed earth, often damp with rain that seeps through the roof. Straw is scattered across the ground, changed rarely alive with vermin. Smoke from the hearth has no chimney to escape. It lingers in the air, burning lungs and eyes. Children cough through the night, their cries muffled by the weight of sickness. Even the grander homes are no havens. Behind the tapestries and carved beams, the same foul air lingers, the same filth gathers, the same pests crawl unseen. No one peasant or noble is truly clean. Imagine waking each morning to this. Imagine walking streets where every step risks disease, where the very act of drinking water could end your life, where the air itself feels heavy with decay. This is not the fairy tale Middle Ages, this is the truth. A world where filth was constant, where survival was fragile, and where the stage was set for horrors yet to come. And in this choking filth, something darker was brewing, an invisible killer, waiting in the shadows of the rat and the flea. Soon it would come, and the world would never be the same again. It began, as all great horrors do, quietly. A cough, a shiver, a sudden fever. At first no one noticed. In the damp alleys of medieval Europe, people coughed all the time. Smoke from open hearths stung the lungs. Dust from straw beds clogged the throat, and winters left bodies weak and aching. A cough was nothing unusual, but then the coughing grew. It was joined by fever, then swelling. A neighbor fell silent, then a whole household, then an entire street. Word spread faster than fire. A sickness had come. The year was 1347. Ships from the east docked at Messina, in Sicily. They carried not only merchants and goods, but rats. And clinging to those rats were fleas. And clinging to those fleas was something far smaller, far deadlier, an invisible killer, Yersinia pestis. At first, it was confined to the ports. But ports are the beating heart of trade. Ships sail out, ships sail in, rats scurry from dock to warehouse. Fleas leap from skin to cloth to skin again. Within months, the sickness spread inland, racing through Italy, Spain, and France, and soon beyond. By 1348, it was in England. By 1351, it had consumed nearly all of Europe. They called it the pestilence, the great mortality. We know it now as the Black Death. The symptoms were like something torn from a nightmare. First, the swellings, painful lumps in the armpits, the groin, the neck. Buboes, they were called, blackened and swollen, oozing foul-smelling pus. Then came fever, shaking chills and searing pain that racked the body. Some victims coughed blood, staining their lips red. Others slipped into delirium, their minds collapsing before their bodies did. And then came silence. Most who caught it died within a few days. Imagine living in that world. You wake to find your neighbor's door sealed with chalk. A priest mutters prayers outside, refusing to enter. Inside, the family is already gone. The streets are quiet, but not with peace, with fear. Shops are shuttered. Markets are abandoned. The bells of churches toll constantly, ringing not for worship but for death. No one knew what caused it. Science as we know it did not exist. Instead, fear gave birth to wild theories. Some whispered that it was a punishment from God, sent to scourge sinful mankind. Others blamed the alignment of the planets, believing the very heavens had turned against them. Rumors spread that wells had been poisoned by Jews, and mobs rose up to slaughter entire communities in their terror. Doctors, desperate and ignorant, turned to the only tools they knew. They bled patients with knives, hoping to release the sickness. They pressed burning herbs to the swellings. They filled the air with smoke, believing foul odors could drive out the disease. Nothing worked. The plague laughed at their efforts and claimed them too. Whole towns vanished. Villages emptied overnight. In some places, carts rolled through the streets, piled high with bodies, while the cry echoed, "Bring out your dead." In others, there were no carts, no priests, no mourners, only the silence of death. The numbers are staggering. Historians believe that between 75 and 200 million people perished. In Europe alone, nearly 1 in 3 was gone. Imagine that. Every third face you know, erased. Entire families wiped out. Whole bloodlines ended. The very map of villages, towns, and cities redrawn by absence. And the plague did not strike once and vanish. Again and again, in waves across the centuries. Even when it weakened, it haunted memory. Mothers watched children cough and wondered if the shadow was returning. Fields lay fallow, churches empty, streets deserted, all under the heavy hand of fear. The greatest horror was not just the death, it was the unraveling of society. Priests abandoned their flocks, terrified of catching the sickness. Parents left children, husbands left wives. Love and duty collapsed beneath the weight of terror. Humanity itself seemed to rot. And yet, some clung to hope. Some prayed harder, believing salvation could be found through devotion. Others turned to madness, whipping themselves in the streets, hoping their suffering would earn God's mercy. Still others plunged into hedonism, feasting, drinking, and sinning, declaring, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die." The plague was not just a disease. It was a mirror, revealing both the darkest and most desperate parts of the human soul. When it finally loosened its grip, Europe was changed forever. Fields lay overgrown, villages abandoned, cities diminished. But something else stirred in the ruins. Survivors began to demand more. Wages rose, Feudal bonds weakened, the world inched slowly, painfully toward something new. But in the 14th century, no one saw that future. They saw only the terror of now. And for them, the Middle Ages would forever be remembered, not for knights or castles, but for the black shadow of death. Imagine you are accused of a crime in the Middle Ages, not murder, not theft perhaps. Something as small as speaking ill of a noble or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps your neighbor envies your land. Perhaps your rival whispers that you are a heretic, and so you are taken. There is no presumption of innocence, no lawyer to defend you, no promise of a fair trial. Instead, justice in the Middle Ages is something darker, something shaped not by truth but by fear, superstition, and cruelty. In the heart of a medieval town square, a wooden platform rises. Crowds gather, not out of outrage but out of excitement. For justice in this age is also entertainment. A man is dragged forward, shackled and broken. He is accused of theft. The sentence is not prison, for prisons are rare and chains cost money. Instead, his punishment is made public. His ears are nailed to a post for hours, the flesh tearing as he struggles. In another place, a thief has his hand cut off with a single stroke, the crowd gasping as blood darkens the dirt. The message is clear. Justice is not about reform. It is about fear. It is about showing everyone what happens when you step out of line. But what if there is no proof? What if guilt cannot be decided? In the Middle Ages, proof is not always needed. Instead, God himself is asked to decide. This was called the trial by ordeal. Imagine your hands bound as you are lowered into a vat of boiling water. You must plunge your arm deep, retrieving a stone from the bottom. Days later, a priest inspects the wound. If it heals cleanly, God has declared you innocent. If it festers, you are guilty. Or perhaps you are forced to carry a red-hot iron across the church. 3 paces, 5 steps, 10. The searing metal burns into your palms, the smell of flesh filling the air. Again, the wounds will tell your fate. And then there is the ordeal of water. You are tied and cast into a river. If you sink, you are innocent, for the water has accepted you. If you float, you are guilty, guilty of witchcraft, of heresy, of whatever charge was laid against you. But of course, most who sank did not survive long enough to enjoy their innocence. Then came the Inquisition, casting its long, dark shadow over Europe. Heresy, any deviation from church teaching, was considered worse than murder, worse than treason. For to mislead souls, they said, was to endanger eternity itself. And so, the accused were dragged into cold stone chambers where torturers waited. The methods were many, each more nightmarish than the last. The rock a simple device of wood and rope. Limbs tied, the wheel turned, joints slowly pulled apart. The cracking of bone was not just agony, it was confession. Stripetta, the victim hoisted by their arms behind their back, shoulders wrenching from their sockets. Body dropped suddenly and stopped short, tearing ligaments with every fall. The thumbscrew iron pressing into bone until fingernails split and flesh burst. And then there were the infamous devices whispered of for centuries. The Iron Maiden, a coffin of spikes, and the Pear of Anguish. A device inserted and twisted until flesh tore. Whether every one of these was used or not, the message is the same. Confession was not sought by reason. It was forced, dragged from the body by pain, and when confession was given true or false, it was enough. The sentence was death. Executions were not hidden away. They were public theater. The condemned was marched through the streets, jeered and spat upon. At the gallows, the noose was placed around their neck. Sometimes the drop was short, and the victim strangled slowly, face darkening, body twitching for minutes as the crowd watched. Others were burned alive, tied to stakes, flames licking at their feet as smoke choked their lungs. The fire was fed slowly, prolonging agony. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the prayers of priests and the shouts of the crowd. Still others faced beheading. A single clean stroke was rare. Often the executioner needed 2, 3, even 4 blows to sever the head. Each swing a reminder of the brutal imperfection of medieval justice. For crimes deemed especially heinous treason, rebellion, the punishment was worse still. Dismemberment, disembowelment, bodies cut into quarters. And displayed on city gates, a warning written in blood and bone. For ordinary people, the message was clear. Justice was not protection, it was terror. It was a system designed to keep the poor in fear, the devout obedient, and the powerful unchallenged. To live in the Middle Ages was to live under the constant threat of accusation. A whispered word could see you branded a thief, a witch, or a heretic. And once accused, few escaped unscathed. And yet, the people accepted it. For in a world of chaos, of plague, famine, and war, justice, no matter how brutal, seemed to offer order. Better to live in fear, they thought, than in lawless anarchy. But what kind of society survives when justice itself is a weapon of terror? In the Middle Ages, punishment was not just about crime, it was about control. It left scars not only on the bodies of the condemned, but on the very soul of Europe. In the Middle Ages, there was one power greater than any king, one authority higher than any noble, one presence that touched every village, every household, every soul. It was not the crown, it was not the sword, it was the church. Imagine waking at dawn in a medieval village. The first sound you hear is not the crow of a rooster, but the tolling of the church bell. Its chime marks the hours of the day, the cycle of prayer, the rhythm of existence itself. Birth, baptism, marriage, confession, death, burial. Every milestone of life was tied to the church. Without its blessing, you were nothing. Without its sacraments, your soul was lost. For the medieval mind, the church was not just a building or a priest. It was the gateway to eternity. Heaven and hell were not abstract. They were real, imminent, terrifying. A single sin could condemn you to eternal fire. Salvation lay only through the rituals and forgiveness granted by the church. And so, fear and faith walked hand in hand. At the heart of this power was a weapon invisible yet devastating: excommunication. To be excommunicated was not just to be cut off from church services, it was to be cut off from life itself. You could not marry, you could not be buried in sacred ground, your prayers were unheard, your soul unredeemed. Friends turned away, family shunned you, neighbors would not trade with you. For kings and nobles, excommunication was a political death sentence. A ruler excommunicated by the Pope risked rebellion, desertion, even assassination. Entire kingdoms trembled under its threat. It was a power no sword could match. But the church's greatest fear was not kings, not nobles, it was heresy. To question the teachings of the church was to question the salvation of souls. And heresy spread like fire, a whisper in a marketplace, a book copied in secret, a sermon delivered in the night. The Inquisition rose to root out heretics wherever they hid. Men and women were dragged from their homes, accused of false beliefs. Torture awaited them, for pain was seen as a purifier, a way to reveal hidden truth. Many confessed to crimes they never committed, their words wrung from them by agony. Those who recanted might be spared, but many others burned. At dawn, in city squares, heretics were bound to stakes, faggots piled high around their feet. The fire was lit, smoke rose, and the crowd watched as bodies blackened and crumbled to ash. The message was clear: question nothing, doubt nothing, believe or burn. But the power of the church was not only spiritual, it was financial. In towns across Europe, priests sold indulgences, slips of parchment promising forgiveness of sins for a price. The wealthy could buy their way out of purgatory, while the poor scraped together coins to spare their souls a few years of suffering after death. Relics, too, filled the landscape. A fragment of the true cross, a vial of a saint's blood, the bones of holy men and women, each promised blessings and protection. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to touch them, leaving offerings that filled the coffers of churches and monasteries. The line between faith and exploitation blurred, and fear made people pay. The church was not only a spiritual authority, it was also a temporal power. Monasteries owned vast lands, richer than many kings. Bishops commanded armies. The Pope himself could raise nations to war with a single Caltha, crusades a testament to that power. In village life, the priest was not only your confessor, but also your judge, your teacher, your ruler. His word carried the weight of heaven. His disapproval was enough to brand you dangerous. Imagine the terror of being called before him, accused of sin or heresy. Imagine kneeling in the cold stone nave, the eyes of the entire village on you as the priest declared your fate. To be shamed was bad enough. To be cast out was worse. What gave the church its deepest hold was not gold or armies, but the fear of what came after death. The medieval imagination burned with visions of hell, fire and torment, demons dragging souls into endless pain. Paintings on church walls showed sinners writhing in flame, devoured by beasts, clawed by devils. Heaven, by contrast, was radiant but distant. Few believed they would ever reach it. Purgatory, the in-between place of punishment and cleansing, was where most expected to go. And the only escape from purgatory's fire was prayer, penance, indulgence, 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 and above all, the mercy of the church. And so people obeyed. They confessed, they paid, they prayed. Not because they loved, but because they feared. But faith was not only terror. For many, it was also comfort. In a world of plague, famine, and war, the church promised meaning, order, hope. Monasteries preserved learning, offered charity, tended the sick. The same bells that tolled in warning also rang in celebration. The same prayers that terrified also soothed. The church was both light and shadow, salvation and damnation, hope and fear, and in that paradox lay its greatest power, the ability to rule hearts as well as bodies, to hold not just the land, not just the crown, but the soul itself. For in the Middle Ages, kings ruled kingdoms, lords ruled lands, but the church ruled eternity. The Middle Ages were not only an age of knights and kings, of battles and crusades. For most people, life was far simpler and far more fragile. It all depended on food, on whether the crops grew, whether the rains came, whether the harvest filled the barns. But in this world of fragile balance, a single bad season could spell disaster. And when disaster came, it came with a vengeance. Picture a medieval peasant's year. From spring to autumn, the rhythm of life was the field. Men and women bent their backs beneath the sun, plowing, sowing, reaping, threshing. Children scattered seeds, elders watched the skies. There were no machines, no engines, no chemical fertilizers. Every ear of grain was grown by hand, harvested by sickle, threshed by flail. And when the harvest came, it was stored carefully in barns, guarded against rats, measured for winter. But what if the rains failed? What if frost struck early? What if armies marched through, trampling the crops and burning the fields? The balance shattered. Hunger crept in. One of the darkest examples struck in the early 14th century. The years 1315 to 1317 are remembered as the Great Famine. Unrelenting rains soaked the fields, rotted the crops, drowned the seeds. Grain spoiled before it could be cut. Hay for animals turned to black sludge. Even salt, used to preserve meat, melted into uselessness. Winter came early, harsh and cruel. By spring, granaries were empty. People slaughtered livestock not for trade, but for survival. And once the animals were gone, the true hunger began. Imagine a village where the cupboards are bare. Mothers trying to feed children with boiled grass and bark stripped from trees. Fathers digging up roots, desperate to find anything to fill an empty belly. People grew so thin their ribs jutted through skin, so weak they could not stand. Bread, the very heart of medieval diet, became rare, then vanished. Some tried to bake bread from acorns or ground weeds, bitter and barely edible. Others ground bones into flour. And when even that failed, desperation drove people to horror. Chronicles whisper of parents abandoning children, of bodies dug from graves and eaten in secret, of people turning on one another for flesh. Whether all these tales are true or not, they show the terror of the time, that hunger stripped away not only strength, but humanity itself. As famine spread, so did death. Diseases thrived in weakened bodies: typhus, dysentery, fevers. Starving people wandered the roads, searching for food, only to collapse in ditches. Cities turned away the desperate, fearing plague. Villages guarded their meager stores with weapons. Law broke down. Theft and violence rose, not from greed, but from desperation. Even kings could not escape. Armies starved as supplies ran out. Castles emptied their granaries. Nobles tightened their belts. Hunger was the great equalizer, and yet the poor always suffered first and worst. Historians believe millions perished in those grim years, not with the sudden terror of plague, but with the slow, gnawing death of starvation. And the Great Famine was not the only one. Throughout the Middle Ages, famine returned again and again. Crops failed, livestock died, war trampled the fields. To be medieval was to live always with the shadow of hunger. Every winter, families prayed their stores would last until spring. Every storm, every frost, every swarm of locusts was a threat to survival. And hunger left scars deeper than death. Children born in famine years grew up stunted, their bodies weakened, their lives shortened. Villages emptied, generations marked by hunger's hand. And where reason failed, superstition grew. Some believed famine was a punishment from God, sent for sins unconfessed. Others blamed witches, Jews, or foreigners, turning desperation into hatred. In some places, rituals were performed to call back the sun or drive away storms, chants, processions, even sacrifices. But still, the fields remained barren. Still, the stomach remained empty. Still, the hunger remained. Perhaps the greatest horror of famine is not silence, but sound. The crying of children too weak to rise from the straw. The moaning of elders whose strength is gone, scratching of empty bowls, the gnawing of teeth on bark, the endless growl of a stomach that will not be filled. And then, at last, silence. A silence that falls not only on one household, but on an entire land. When the rains finally ceased, when the sun returned and the crops grew tall again, the survivors rejoiced. But deep down, the fear never left. For in the Middle Ages, famine was never truly gone. It waited at the edge of every field, in every cloud, and every frost. And the memory of it haunted all who had lived through its hunger. In the end, famine was not just the absence of food, it was the presence of fear, the knowledge that life hung by a thread, and that thread could be cut at any moment. In the Middle Ages, death did not always come with sword or plague. Sometimes, it came slowly, silently, with an empty stomach. The Middle Ages were not a time of peace. They were a time of fire, steel, and endless bloodshed. For while famine starved the land and plague filled graves, another enemy stalked the people of medieval Europe: war. It was not a rare calamity. It was a constant drumbeat. To be born in the Middle Ages was to grow up beneath the shadow of conflict, to live always within reach of fire and sword. Wars did not simply come and go, they lingered. Decades of sieges, raids, and battles scarred the land. Villages were burned, fields trampled, churches looted, families shattered. For the common man or woman, war meant soldiers marching through the fields, taking grain, livestock, and firewood. It meant taxation to feed kings and armies. It meant young men being called away, never to return. And war had no season. It could come in the heat of summer or in the frost of winter. Sometimes it was declared by kings, sometimes ignited by lords, sometimes fought in silence by raiders and mercenaries who needed no excuse but hunger and greed. Perhaps the most infamous of all was the 100 Years' War between England and France. It began in 1337, not with one battle, but with a claim. The English crown believed it had the right to rule France, and so armies gathered, banners were raised, and swords were sharpened. The war would last not one generation, but several. 8 grandfathers fought, their sons followed, their grandsons bled on the same fields. Battles like Poitiers and Agincourt turned farmland into slaughter fields. Thousands of arrows rained down, armor shattered, knights drowned in mud. The cries of war echoed across Europe for more than a century. For those who lived through it, there was no before and after. There was only war and endless tide of blood. Yet war was not only knights and kings clashing in great battles. For peasants, the true horror was the raid. Imagine. Dawn breaks and smoke rises on the horizon. Riders gallop in, swords flashing, torches burning, huts are set aflame, livestock seized, children dragged screaming. The raid was sudden, merciless, and often repeated. Villages might burn not once, but many times in a single decade. Survivors rebuilt, only to see it torn down again. There was no escape. Castles might stand strong, but the people outside, those who worked the fields, were left exposed to fire and steel. When peace was declared, the danger did not end. Soldiers without masters became mercenaries, gathering into bands known as free companies. These men were hardened by years of killing. They knew no trade but war. And when kings no longer paid them, they paid themselves by pillaging the countryside. They were ghosts of war, drifting from town to town, demanding tribute, burning what they could not steal. A peasant's mercenary raid was as terrifying as any plague, for it came with fire, rape, and murder. And then there were the sieges. Siege warfare was the slowest and cruelest face of medieval conflict. Castles and walled cities became prisons, trapping not only soldiers but innocent families inside. Food dwindled, water turned foul, disease crept in. Months could pass in suffocating fear, waiting for the next assault. Outside the walls, attackers hurled stones with trebuchets, launched fiery missiles, and tunneled beneath walls to collapse them. Inside, defenders grew weaker, thinner, desperate. There are tales of people boiling leather, grass, even rats to survive. Chronicles whisper of darker things of human flesh eaten in secret. And when the walls finally fell, when the gates were broken, the true horror began. All cities, taken by storm, were not spared. They were slaughtered. Soldiers killed without mercy, women violated, children sold into slavery. The sack of a city was not just victory, was vengeance. Even the church, that great pillar of medieval life, was soaked in blood. Crusades were declared, not only in the Holy Land, but within Europe itself. Armies marched under the cross, claiming to fight for God but leaving only ash behind. The crusade against the Cathars in southern France, the wars against pagans in the Baltic. The Spanish Reconquista turned faith into fire and war without end. And for the men who fought, killing became salvation, and death in battle became a promise of heaven. But for the people left behind, war brought only ruin. The land became scarred, burned, and barren. Fields could not grow crops where armies had marched. Towns once bustling with trade became ghostly ruins. Families lost fathers, sons, brothers. Women were left widowed, children orphaned. And war was not short. It was not a single event. It dragged on year after year until entire generations knew nothing else. Even when one war ended, another began. Borders shifted, kings rose and fell, but the killing did not stop. To be medieval was to accept that war was eternal. Peace was only a pause between campaigns, a fragile breath before the next storm. The clash of steel, the thunder of hooves, screams of the dying. This was the music of the Middle Ages, echoing from castle walls and battlefields, seeping into the dreams of children who grew up beneath its shadow. War was not a story of glory for most. It was not knights in shining armor, nor banners fluttering in the wind. It was hunger, fire, loss, and despair. It was endless. It was merciless. It was the dark truth of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were not only haunted by famine, plague, and war, they were haunted by something far darker: fear itself. For in a world of shadows, storms, and sickness where science was little known, and survival was fragile, the unseen became terrifying. Every thunderstorm was a sign of God's anger. Every failed harvest the work of the devil, every strange sickness a curse cast by a neighbor. And so the people turned their eyes not to reason, but to superstition. They sought enemies in the dark, and they found them. In the early Middle Ages, witchcraft was often dismissed as superstition, a peasant's nonsense. The church warned against belief in magic, claiming it was folly. But as the centuries passed, something changed. Fear grew sharper. The devil was no longer seen as a distant enemy, but as an active hunter, stalking villages, tempting men and women into his service. Every misfortune demanded a cause. If cattle sickened, if crops withered, if a child died in its sleep, surely someone was to blame. The blame often fell on the poor, the old, the different. The witch of the Middle Ages was not yet the broom-riding figure of later folklore. Instead, she was often a neighbor and old woman living at the edge of the village, muttering prayers in a strange way, keeping herbs for medicine, perhaps owning a black cat. She was marked not by what she was, but by how others saw her, an outsider, a misfit, someone who made others uneasy. And once suspicion fell, it was nearly impossible to escape. Accused witches faced grim fates. Trials were not fair, nor just. There were ordeals, tests designed not to find truth, but to force confessions. Some were thrown into rivers, their hands bound. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent. If they floated, they were guilty, for the water, pure and holy, was believed to reject them. Others were pressed with stones, their ribs cracking beneath the weight, until they named accomplices. Some were whipped, branded, or starved until they confessed. And when guilt was declared, the punishment was almost always the same: death by fire. Imagine the scene: a village square. The accused bound to a stake, kindling piled high. The crowd gathered, some in fear, some in excitement, some in relief that it was not their turn. The flames rise. The smoke thickens. Screams echo, mingling with the chants of priests. The fire was not only a punishment, it was a ritual, a cleansing. The belief was that burning the body destroyed the witch's link to the devil, purifying the community. But what it truly did was spread more fear than anyone, at any time, could be next. Though the height of witch hunts came later, in the Renaissance and early modern period, their seeds were sown in the medieval world. Texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, would emerge in the 15th century, instructing how to identify, torture, and destroy witches. But even before this, Europe was already primed for fear. The Black Death, famine, and war had created a world desperate for explanations. And so, the invisible enemy became the witch, an easy scapegoat, a target for collective terror. And it was not only witches. The supernatural world loomed everywhere in medieval minds. Demons whispered in the night, tempting monks in monasteries. Spirits wandered graveyards, restless and angry. Werewolves stalked forests, their howls said to echo through the mist. The line between faith and fear blurred. Saints' relics were treasured for their power to heal, while curses were dreaded as weapons of ruin. Amulets were worn, charms muttered, holy water sprinkled, all to keep away what could not be seen. The devil was not a distant myth. He was a daily terror. And so, many innocents died. Women, yes, but also men, even children. Entire families destroyed by accusation. Communities torn apart by suspicion. The tragedy was not only the death of those condemned, but the slow poisoning of trust. Neighbors watched neighbors, families doubted one another, entire villages lived in paranoia. The true darkness was not witchcraft itself, but the fear of it. Even as centuries passed, the witch hunts only grew. The seeds planted in the Middle Ages blossomed into the infernos of the early modern era, when tens of thousands would die in Europe's great witch craze. But the medieval world was where it began, where fear was given a face, and that face was burned in fire. In the end, the witch hunts were not about witches at all. They were about fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of difference. Fear of a world too harsh to understand. And in that fear, the Middle Ages revealed one of its darkest truths: that the greatest enemy was not famine, nor plague, nor even war. It was ourselves. In the shadows of the Middle Ages, there existed a system designed not to protect, not to heal, but to control through fear, suspicion, and terror. It was called the Inquisition. The Inquisition began in the 12th century, a tool of the Church to root out heresy beliefs deemed dangerous to the faith. But heresy was not always clear. A whispered doubt, a secret text, even kindness to a suspected heretic could draw attention. And once accused, there was no easy escape. The Inquisition was not a court of reason, it was a machine, efficient, relentless, and merciless. Imagine being accused. You are summoned to a cold stone chamber, your hands trembling. Priests, judges, and scribes surround you. You are asked questions, watched carefully. Your words are weighed, measured, and often twisted. You are allowed no defense, no advocate. The mere hint of suspicion can seal your fate. The accused were often friends, neighbors, or family members. The accusation alone carried immense weight. When suspicion lingered, torture was used not to punish, but to extract confession. The methods were many. The rack, stretching the body until joints cracked. The strappetto arms bound behind the back and hoisted high, tearing shoulders. The iron chair, covered in spikes, slowly pressed against flesh. Pain became the tool of truth. Confessions, whether true or false, were all that mattered. Once a confession was given, the sentence followed inevitably. Those condemned faced death, often in public. Burning at the stake was the most infamous method, intended to purify both the accused and the community. Some were hanged first, others slowly roasted alive. The crowd watched not only in horror but as witnesses to the power of the church. Bodies might be displayed, ashes scattered, names written in records, warning all who survived. The Inquisition was as much a spectacle as it was a legal system, fear itself a tool of governance. The Inquisition did not rely solely on punishment. It thrived on suspicion, rumor, and surveillance. Informants reported whispers from neighbors. Confessors passed along secrets shared in confidence. A glance, a word, a book, anything could mark someone for investigation, and the fear was pervasive. Villagers walked carefully, lest their own curiosity or kindness be twisted into guilt. Families became fragmented by mistrust. Children learned to whisper, to hide their thoughts, to obey unquestioningly. The Inquisition spread across Europe. In Spain, it became an unrelenting force against Jews, Muslims, and conversos. In France, it hunted Cathars, rooting them out from mountain villages. In Italy, inquisitors moved through towns, their presence a shadow over every home. No one was truly safe. The machinery of fear extended from the streets to the courts, from towns to the countryside. Even kings and nobles had to tread carefully, lest their authority be challenged by church power. What made the Inquisition so effective was not just the physical pain, but the psychological terror. People lived under the constant threat that their beliefs, their words, even their thoughts could be judged. Confession was demanded, and silence or hesitation could be deadly. Fear became internalized, an ever-present companion. This fear controlled behavior, shaped communities, and even dictated morality. The church's reach was total not by sword alone, but by shaping the very minds of its subjects. The Inquisition's power lasted for centuries. Its methods spread, evolved, and became more codified. But its essence remained the same: suspicion, torture, execution, and the unrelenting use of fear as control. For those who lived in its shadow, the world was unpredictable, dark, and dangerous. The machinery of fear ensured obedience, but at a terrible cost: trust, freedom, and human dignity. Even after its decline, the shadow lingered. The Inquisition became a warning, a symbol of what happens when fear and power are fused into an unstoppable machine. The Inquisition reminds us of the true terror of the Middle Ages. It was not just the plague, not just famine, not just war. It was the control of fear itself, wielded by an institution that decided who would live, who would die, and who would be remembered or forgotten. In the Middle Ages, death could be sudden or slow, natural or forced, but fear was constant, and the Inquisition was its most perfect expression. When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds often leap to kings, knights, or terrifying events like plagues and wars. But for the majority of people, life was far from the grandeur of castles or the horror of inquisitions. Life was grueling, fragile, and endlessly unpredictable. Most medieval people lived in small villages, scattered across the countryside. Thatched-roof huts huddled together, their walls of wattle and daub barely keeping out the rain. Smoke rose from the chimneys, carrying the smell of cooking, but also of disease, waste, and overcrowding. Villagers worked on the Lord's manor, cultivating fields, tending animals, and maintaining the land. In return, they were allowed small plots to grow their own food, but even this was precarious. Failed harvest could mean starvation. A heavy tax could ruin a family. Disease could sweep through homes faster than anyone could flee. Every day was a struggle, a constant balancing act between survival and collapse. From dawn to dusk, villagers labored. Men plowed fields, sowed seeds, repaired fences, and hauled water. Women tended gardens, cooked over open fires, cared for children, spun wool, and brewed ale. Children worked alongside adults, learning the craft of survival from an early age. But work was never guaranteed to feed a family. Droughts, floods, and infestations could destroy crops overnight, and when crops failed, desperation followed. Even leisure was rare. Festivals and holy days offered brief reprieves, moments to celebrate with dancing, music, and feasting, but they were fragile islands of joy in a sea of hardship. For most, food was simple and repetitive. Bread was the staple, coarse and dark, made from rye or barley. Porridge, cabbage, beans, and occasional meat were luxuries. Fish was eaten in regions near rivers or coasts, and cheese or milk supplemented diets, but never abundantly. Hunger was never far away. Villagers learned to store food carefully, to cook scraps, and sometimes, in the worst of times, to survive on weeds, roots, or even bark. The shadow of famine hung over every year, a constant reminder of how fragile life was. Religion permeated daily life. Villagers attended Mass, observed holy days, and followed church rules strictly, not always out of devotion, but out of fear. Confession, tithes, and prayers were as much part of survival as plowing or sowing. Breaking church law could bring fines, punishment, or worse. And yet, faith also offered hope, promise of protection, of mercy, of meaning beyond the harshness of daily existence. In towns, life was different, but not necessarily easier. Craftsmen, merchants, and laborers formed guilds, controlling trade and protecting their work. Blacksmiths, bakers, weavers, and shoemakers labored long hours, producing goods for townsfolk and nobility alike. But towns also suffered from disease, overcrowding, and fire. Narrow streets and wooden buildings meant that a single spark could destroy entire neighborhoods. Trade brought wealth, but also vulnerability. A bad harvest elsewhere could raise prices and starve the poor. Even in towns, survival required vigilance, cunning, and sometimes luck. Despite the hardships, people found ways to laugh, sing, and celebrate. Minstrels traveled from village to village, sharing songs of love, war, and heroism. Festivals, fairs, and markets offered rare moments of connection. Stories and legends were passed orally, blending history with myth. Tales of dragons, spirits, saints, and heroes shaped imagination, providing both amusement and warning. For children, play existed amid danger. Games imitated work or battle, building strength and skill. Folk tales taught lessons about morality, bravery, and survival. Marriage was often arranged, dictated by economics, alliances, or survival needs. Women worked alongside husbands in the fields or workshops, managing households and raising children in a world of constant uncertainty. Childbirth was dangerous. Midwives assisted, but many mothers and infants did not survive. Families were tight-knit, but vulnerability was constant, and loss was a frequent companion. Disease was a constant threat. Without modern medicine, even minor injuries could become fatal infections. Herbal remedies, superstition, and the prayers of clergy were often the only tools available. Hygiene was limited. Waste was disposed of in streets or rivers, creating perfect breeding grounds for disease. The air carried smoke, dust, and the stench of the dead. Survival was as much about avoiding illness as about working the land. And yet people endured. Despite famine, plague, war, and fear, life went on. Villagers sowed seeds again each spring, crafted tools and goods, celebrated holy days, and raised children. They built communities, shared knowledge, and adapted to relentless challenges. Life was fragile, but it was lived with courage, resourcefulness, and determination. The Middle Ages were not only an age of darkness and terror, they were also an age of survival, of resilience, of ordinary people shaping their existence amid unimaginable adversity. The Middle Ages have long been called the Dark Ages, an era of famine, war, disease, and fear. Yet as we look back across the centuries, we realize that even in darkness, seeds of transformation were sown. What the Middle Ages lacked in comfort and certainty, it made up for in resilience, innovation, and the shaping of Europe's future. For centuries, fear dominated life. The specter of famine, war, plague, the Inquisition, and witch hunts shaped behavior, communities, and belief systems. But fear also taught lessons. It forced societies to adapt, to develop laws, traditions, and rituals that offered some protection and guidance. The Church, though often wielding terror, also preserved knowledge. Monasteries copied manuscripts, kept libraries alive, and maintained learning through centuries when chaos threatened civilization itself. Even in hardship, the Middle Ages witnessed remarkable ingenuity. Agriculture improved, heavier plows, crop rotation, water mills increased productivity and eventually supported growing populations. Towns grew, marketplaces, trade routes, and guilds formed the backbone of early urbanization. Architecture soared, cathedrals, bridges, and castles combined practical engineering with awe-inspiring artistry. Survival demanded creativity. Each new tool, each improvement in farming or construction, slowly transformed Europe, laying the groundwork for the Renaissance. From brutal justice to the machinery of the Inquisition, medieval Europe experimented with systems of law, punishment, and social order. Though often cruel, these experiences ultimately shaped modern legal systems. Concepts of trial, evidence, and authority evolved from mistakes and abuses of the past. Society learned slowly that fear alone could not maintain stability, that order required fairness, reason, and accountability. The stories of the Middle Ages still haunt us. Legends of knights, witches, saints, and monsters endure in literature, art, and folklore. The myths and fears of the time reflected both the horrors people endured and the resilience they displayed. Tales of heroism, betrayal, love, and loss mirror the universal human experience, connecting us across centuries. Even horror and superstition left a mark. Gothic architecture, moral allegories, and dramatic storytelling all trace roots to this era. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Middle Ages is not the wars, famine, or fear, but the endurance of humanity through it all. Ordinary people survived unimaginable suffering, built communities, preserved knowledge, and adapted to relentless challenges. Kings, knights, and clergy rose and fell, but the ordinary lives continued, leaving traces that shaped future generations. The Middle Ages remind us that civilization is fragile, that fear, power, and cruelty can dominate, but resilience, innovation, and community endure. By the late Middle Ages, the world began to change. Trade expanded, universities formed, printing spread knowledge, and cities grew into centers of culture and power. The Renaissance, with its art, science, and philosophy, would emerge on the foundations laid in this turbulent era. Even the darkest lessons, the terror of the Inquisition, the horrors of famine and war, served as cautionary tales. They informed law, morality, and governance for centuries to come. Walk through a modern European city, and you will still see the echoes. Gothic cathedrals, cobblestone streets, fortified castles, stories of knights, witches, and saints continue to captivate imaginations. The Middle Ages were brutal, terrifying, and dark, but they were also formative, shaping the world in ways that still resonate. And in understanding that darkness, we come to understand ourselves, our fears, our resilience, and the enduring quest for survival, order, and meaning. The Middle Ages were more than history. They were a story of humanity's struggle against the harshest realities: famine, war, disease, fear, and death. Yet from that struggle came endurance, community, knowledge, and creativity. Civilization survived and grew stronger. The darkness of the Middle Ages was not the end. It was the forge in which Europe's future was shaped, a reminder that even in the deepest shadow, light can emerge. And so, we reach the end of our journey through the Middle Ages, a world of shadows, of fear, and of survival. We've walked through famine and starvation, through the terror of war, the grip of the Inquisition, and the haunting whispers of witches and demons. We've glimpsed the lives of ordinary people, their courage, their struggles, and their resilience in a world that spared no one. Yet, amid the darkness, we've also seen humanity endure. Knowledge preserved, communities built, art created, and traditions passed down. The Middle Ages were more than terror, they were the forge of civilization, shaping the world we live in today. History is not just a story of kings and battles, it's the story of people, of fear, of hope, and of survival. And by understanding the past, we come to understand ourselves. If you've journeyed with us through this dark and fascinating era, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden truths of history. And click the notification bell so you never miss a story that brings the past to life. Remember, history is never truly boring sometimes. It's darker, stranger, and more suspenseful than fiction itself. Thank you for watching, and until next time, may the lessons of the past guide you through the present.